Let's get ready to grumble! Hey, everybody, it's Steve, and we're going to do something called Let's Get Ready to Grumble, as you could tell by the intro. Folks, this is supposed to be fun and cheeky. It's going to be back and forth. It's going to be a little bit punchy, but the truth of the matter is we got three really important stories today. The first of which, we're going to talk about international law, and does it really even matter if the U.S. is only focused on its enemies? If international law doesn't account for the U.S., what good is it? That's number one. Number two, we're going to be talking about Joltin' Joe Manchin, President Manchin, as it were, and his grift out of West Virginia in the coal industry. And lastly, we got a surprise subject where one of Bernie Sanders' team is actually looking at propping up Ro Khanna as a potential presidential candidate in 2024 should Joe Biden not seek re-election. So with that, let's go to round one. Bring it on. All right. So Caitlin Johnstone wrote a really, really important piece today that captured the idea that international law is really not international law. There are those that would come out and tell you that, in fact, the world is one ginormous anarchy, because reality is that if the U.S. is never held accountable for its actions, what is law anyway? I mean, if we get away with murder, literally, then do we even have international law? So let's go ahead and take a look at the article. Colin, bring her on up. So you scroll down, she jumps right in. One of the most powerful sets of tweets I think you could even ask for. And the tweet starts off like this. I've been asked if I think the invasion of the Ukraine is illegal. My answer is, if we don't hold our own leaders to account, we can't hold other leaders to account. If the law is not applied consistently, it is not the law. It is simply an excuse we use to target our enemies. We will pay a heavy price for our hubris of 2003 in the future. We didn't just fail to punish Bush and Blair. We rewarded them. We reelected them. We knighted them. If you want to see Putin in his true light, imagine him landing a jet and then saying, mission accomplished. All right, bring me up there, Colin. We're going to go into this. So as we look around the country, as we look around the world, when have you ever seen the United States held responsible for any of the bombings it's done, any of the drone strikes it's done, any of the illegal actions it's done? Repeatedly, we talk about bringing down strongmen. We point all around the world at all these dictators. But United States has entered into wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen. We've seen stuff going on in AFRICOM. We've seen stuff go by proxy throughout South America. And now we realize that within the last year, the United States CIA has been arming Ukraine. Now, whether you like Putin or not is not really the issue here. The issue is the United States has interests, and they judge whether or not someone is an illegal actor by whether or not they're on Team USA. Everyone else, they get knocked out. Everyone else gets the nice boot of the CIA brought before them, because no one thinks we're at war, right? We're not at war. We're just dropping bombs of love everywhere we go. So with that, bring the article back up. So what she says, she goes, as far as I can tell, this point is logically unassailable. International law is a meaningless concept when it only applies to the people the U.S. power alliance doesn't like. This point is driven home by the life of McBride himself, whose own government responded to him publicizing suppressed information about war crimes committed by Australian forces in Afghanistan by charging him as a criminal. Neither George W. Bush nor Tony Blair are in prison cells at The Hague, where international law says they ought to be. Bush is still painting away from the comfort of his own home, issuing proclamations comparing Putin to Hitler, and ultimately platforming arguments for interventionism in Ukraine. Blair is merrily warmongering his charred little heart out, saying NATO should not rule directly, attacking Russian forces in what amounts to a call for thermonuclear world war. They are free as birds, singing the same old demonic songs from the rooftops. And Sky News here, it's like Tony Blair calls for NATO to not to rule out military intervention against Russia and the Ukraine. Now, think about this, right? Russia is a nuclear power. And Russia is not a small person, not a small country in any way, shape, or form. And they have every right to defend themselves, just as any other country does, just as Ukraine does, just as the entire of Europe does. Every country has a right to defend its sovereign borders. But this is completely unnecessary, unless, of course, it gets in the way of the United States interests as it pertains to real resource extraction, as we've seen through the IMF, and we have seen through all sorts of different aspects of U.S. foreign policy, which is baked into just about everything we see and read and do throughout the world. Everything has some form of U.S. interest in it. But here we are looking at the neoliberal regime of the world, Tony Blair being one of them, still one of the people that has blood on his hands, going back to the Iraq War and even before that. Ultimately, none of the U.S. parties, none of their friends, none of their allies are ever held to account, whether it be Chelsea Manning bringing charges up, whether it be any of the whistleblowers whatsoever. We have no accountability within this government whatsoever. So what say you? Do you think the United States should be taken to The Hague? Do you think that our presidents and our military leaders should, in fact, be brought up on charges for treason or for violating world law, international law? Are we violating the Geneva Convention? Are we doing these things? I think it's empirical that we have. I think there's evidence on top of evidence that we have. But if we go back to this article, Colin, bring the article back up. You realized, obviously, the Iraq war bypassed laws and protocols for military action. The U.S. Military occupation of Syria violated international law, she states. U.S. empire's military power, more importantly, because of its narrative control, the media, folks. This means the international law is only ever enforced with the approval of the empire, and that's the United States. And so if your job is to keep yourself out of trouble, but to make sure everyone else is in trouble, there is no such thing as international law. There's no such thing as international law. If you go back here, the article goes further. It says, this is why the people indicted and detained by the International Criminal Court, the ICC, are always from weaker nations, overwhelmingly African, while the U.S. can get away with actually sanctioning ICC personnel if they so much as talk about investigating the American war crimes and suffer no consequences for it whatsoever. It is also why the 2002, the Bush administration instituted what became known as the Hague Invasion Act, saying military force will be used to liberate any U.S. or U.S. allied military personnel from any ICC attempt to prosecute them for war crimes. It is also why Noam Chomsky famously said that if the Nuremberg laws had continued to be applied with fairness and consistency, then every post-World War II U.S. president would have been hanged. I mean, think about that for a minute. You think about John Bolton, and you think about all the other characters, the neocons, the Wolfowitzes of the world. And the U.S. has been the greatest bully of all time. Our own country, the country that we live in, that our children will live in, that our children will grow up in and inherit. This is what our nation does. And ultimately, you have to ask yourself, what control, if any, do we have to stop the behavior of our nation? If international law is controlled by our nation, and the very people that are committing the crimes are the ones, the actual guarding of the hen house, there is no way in the world that you will ever have a fair, peaceful world, unless, of course, the United States is in control. So let's keep going. Let's get back to the article. And so when you look down here, go a little bit further down. The U.S. continually works to subvert international law enforcement institutions to advance its own interests. When the U.S. was seeking UN authorization for the Gulf War in 1991, Yemen dared to vote against it. Think about that, Yemen. After which a member of the U.S. delegation told Yemen's ambassador, that's the most expensive vote you ever cast. Yemen lost not just $70 million in U.S. foreign aid, but also a valuable labor contract with Saudi Arabia, and a million Yemeni immigrants were sent home by America's Gulf state allies. Simple observation of who is subject to international law enforcement and who is not makes it clear that the very concept of international law is now functionally nothing more than a narrative construct that is used to bludgeon and undermine governments who disobey U.S. centralized empire. That's why the lead up to this confrontation with Russia, we saw a push among empire managers to swap out the term international law with rules-based international order, which can mean absolutely anything. It's entirely up to the interpretation of the world's dominant power structure. So she closes this out as says, as U.S. law professor Dale Carpenter has said, if citizens cannot trust the laws will be enforced in even-handed and honest fashion, they cannot be said to live under the rule of law. Instead, they live under the rule of men, corrupted by the law. This is all the more true of laws which would exist between nations. You don't get to make international law meaningless and then claim that an invasion is illegal. That's not a legitimate thing to do. As long as we are living in a wild, wild west environment created by murderous, globe-spinning empire, which benefits from it, claims about the legality of foreign invasions are just empty sounds. Now, let's talk about that for a minute. You know, the left oftentimes forgets that it's anti-war. Now, I was on with Bryce Green a couple days ago on this very channel, and we discussed the both angles of this war. We discussed the NATO angle. We discussed how Ukraine wanted to be part of the EU and the US was meddling. We talked about that at great length. We talked about the involvement of the IMF, and we talked about the debt peonage that they were pushing on them. We also looked at the history of Russia, and we started understanding better about the way that Russia has typically defended herself. Now, you can look at Putin, who is a flat out horrible, horrible dictator, piece of shit, whatever. However, he's looking out for his interests. He's looking out for his country's interests, just like the rest is looking out for theirs. The difference here is that only one set of interests matters on international law, and that's the United States. Now, believe me, Putin is no good guy here. Anybody that says that is lying to you. Anybody that says that it's okay to invade another nation, right, wrong, or indifferent, is lying to you. However, it must be said, for an entire year now, and maybe even longer, the United States has been gearing up and giving tanks and planes and other military supplements to Ukraine in the case of a Russian invasion. Now, going back to 1998, Joe Biden was on camera saying flat out that he knew all it would take to bring about war in Russia was to try to bring Ukraine into NATO or bring Ukraine into the EU. And guess what? We got it. That's it. Now, I understand the story about the Nazis, and I understand all the rest of that angle, but it's bullshit in the grand scheme of things. In the grand scheme of things, United States empire owns the media apparatus that owns the storylines that we get to hear. Does that mean that Ukraine should be invaded because Putin sucks or something like that? Absolutely not. Does it mean that Ukraine citizens should die simply because Zelensky is not necessarily the nice guy and he's got a cushy place waiting for him in Florida? Absolutely not. No one, the Russian people who are suffering from sanctions and the Ukraine people who are suffering from bullets today. There is massive amounts of suffering, and there's only very few people that win here, and it's all oligarchs, and it's all international law waiting to be had that is not had today because there is no such thing as international law. Great article by Katie Johnstone. Let's go to round two. All right, folks. Talking about Joe Manchin is kind of fun, right? Joe Manchin, he's a clown. Joe Manchin has literally taken over our government because of the evenly divided Senate. Because of that, Joe Manchin has had more power than anyone knows. In fact, some of you may not know this, but Joe Manchin is also, Colin, bring her up. He is also the Democrats' Senate chairman for the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. What a convenient thing when you are a coal robber baron to actually make sure that you have complete control of the Senate for the committee that actually deals with your personal business. Now, let me ask you this out. If you have a public office to represent the nation, but in your backyard, in your home, your entire existence is tied up and pumping dirty coal into the atmosphere. Your entire existence, your fortune comes from coal. And you are on the committee to decide what U.S. policy is going to be. There's something really wrong with that, isn't there? So Rolling Stone wrote an incredible article. I mean, this thing is fascinating. It's long, though, folks. So bear with me. I am not going to read this whole damn thing. It would take us all night long to get through. But Colin, if you'll bring up the article. So one of the things that jumped out, and I'm not going to read, like I said, this thing, you should definitely check this article out. And we'll put the links out there. But one of the big things that came out, and I just think this is hilarious, although it's not hilarious, if that makes any sense. Status Gurma, who was a 26-year-old Sunrise Movement activist who helped to organize protests against Manchin this past fall, calls him the final villain. So if you can imagine playing, Mortal Kombat or something like that and hearing, finish him, he is like the final villain. He's like, you gotten through the entire game and there he is. Why is that? Because Joe Manchin's business is pumping shit into the environment, just cranking it up at a time. We don't have time. We have an existential climate crisis going on right now. And the guy that's in charge of the Senate committee over energy and real resources, etc., he is the owner of the dirtiest fucking stuff known to mankind. Joe Manchin, when he goes to D.C., Joe Manchin literally comes in a houseboat sitting there on the Potomac. No joke. That's where Jolton Joe lives, on a houseboat on the Potomac, a beautiful, gorgeous houseboat on the Potomac. And so what does he do? Joe Biden is allowing this guy to run the country because Joe Biden doesn't have a spine. But there's Joe Manchin, Jolton Joe Manchin. Let's get back to the article, Colin. We're going to go past the part where it talks about at this point in human evolution, this is where we pick it up. At this point in human evolution, burning coal for power is one of the stupidest things humans can do. Coal plants are engines of destruction, not progress, thanks to the rapid evolution of clean energy. There are many better, cheaper, cleaner ways to power our lives. The only reason anyone still burns coal today is because of the enormous political power and inertia that the industry has acquired since the 19th century in America. That power and inertia is embodied in the cruel and cartoonish character of West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin, who paradoxically may have more control over the trajectory of the climate crisis than any other person on the planet right now. And like I said, Status Gurma, 26-year-old Sunrise Movement activist who helped the organized protest against Manchin this past fall, calls him the final villain. Now, scrolling down there, Colin, Manchin's influence, check this out. Manchin's influence comes from the fact that in an evenly divided Senate, he is the swing vote that can make or break legislation. He presents himself as a pragmatic man from a hard scrabble state who is always trying to do the right thing. He values good manners, civility, and sometimes seems to be channeling the folksy charm of another famous West Virginian, test pilot Chuck Yeager, who was immortalized in The Right Stuff. Truth is, Manchin is best understood as a grifter from the ancestral home of King Coal. He is a man with coal dust in his veins who has used political skills to enrich himself, not the people of his state. Drives an Italian-made Maserati, lives on a houseboat on the Potomac when he's in D.C., pals around with corporate CEOs, and has a net worth of as much as $12 million, which is nothing, by the way, compared to Nancy Pelosi and others. More to the point, his wealth has been accumulated through controversial coal-related businesses in his home state, including using his political muscle to keep open the dirtiest coal plant in West Virginia, which paid him nearly $5 million over the past decade in fees for coal handling, as well as costing West Virginia electricity consumers tens of millions of dollars in higher electricity rates. More about the details of that in a moment. Virginia Cantor, who was the ethics counsel to President Obama and Clinton, unabashedly calls Manchin's business operations a grift, which is hilarious coming from Obama and Clinton, right? To Cantor, Manchin's corruption is even more offensive than Donald Trump's. Well, shit, yeah, because at least Donald Trump is out there in your face letting you know he's a piece of shit. Manchin hides behind the D, the shield of the D, the blue wave, right? So Manchin's corruption's even more offensive than Donald Trump's. With Trump, the corruption was discretionary. You could choose to pay thousands of dollars to host an event at Mar-a-Lago or not. I mean, that's kind of hilarious in its own right, isn't it? Cantor tells me, in contrast, Manchin is effectively taking money right out of the pockets of West Virginians when they pay their electric bills. They have no say in it. It's one of the most egregious conflicts of interest I've ever seen. Now, listen, let's come back to this, Colin. So one of the big things about Manchin, obviously, here is that he knows that there's an existential climate crisis. He's like Bob Dole, smoking is not addictive, right? I'm Bob Dole. Ultimately, this man understands full well what's at stake here. He does. There's no getting around it. He is around the information, but his livelihood, his entire fortune, and it's not as much as some. I mean, there's plenty of people that have more. 12 million is not a huge fortune for a guy who really is in control of just about everything. Okay. But regardless, Joe Manchin has got a couple things going on. The article goes through it, but so long. I'm just going to paraphrase some of this. Okay. Ultimately, coal mining is not just a job. If you're a West Virginian, you understand coal is part of your life. It's an identity, and it goes down deeper because it goes generation after generation after generation. If you ever heard the band Stained, the singer for the band Stained now does country music, Aaron Lewis. And one of the songs he talks about is guns. He's talking about his pappy, and he's talking about the truck, the pickup truck, and the dirt roads, and all it paints this vision of what it's like to be a redneck, basically a country boy, right? And he lays it out there. And he's like, I'm damn proud of this gun that my grandpappy gave me, and so forth. So this is all baked in, man. It's deeper than like money. It's deeper than religion with folks. This is culture. This is Americana. This is the make America great again. Okay. And when you look at West Virginia coal country, these coal miners, it's not good enough to say, hey, yeah, we got you a new job. Let's go ahead and just, we'll pay you off, whatever. No, it's not going to do it. You have to have something way more than that. You've got to help them see a transition out of dirty coal, because their entire lives, they've got family members that have come home every day. The smell of coal matters to them. It's like, it's everything. I came from a phone company family. Phone company was everything. The bell-shaped head, everything. Bell Atlantic, CMP, AT&T, all of that stuff baked into the entire family lore. Everything about our family was based on the phone company. Okay. West Virginia, the entire state, huge amounts of the state, shouldn't say the entire state, huge amounts of the state are baked on this. So Joe Manchin is not only seen as a hero protecting the very traditions of West Virginia coal miners, he's one of the good old boys. Okay. And those good old boys, there ain't no buying them off, because it's more a matter of the land that they've promised grandpappy they'd never give up. It's more about the job they promised they'd pass down to their grandkids, etc. So there has to be another way around Joe Manchin. It has to be a way to getting into their hearts and minds and not just calling them dumb fuck hillbillies. Because ultimately, if you do that, they're going to double down, they're going to triple down, and they're not going to change. And unfortunately, Joe Manchin knows this. Joe Manchin is tied so tightly to that kind of culture that the idea of our survival, forget the West Virginians, everyone around the world, ironically, because, climate isn't something that we can just put an artificial boundary and say the United States. No, this is a global crisis, obviously. So everything Joe Manchin's dirty coal puts out into the universe, into the environment, that impacts all of us. So Joe Manchin really is the final villain here. But there's got to be a way. How do you get Joe Manchin out of power? He's not that old. He's got plenty of time. And he shows no inclination of walking away, and there's no inclination of anybody voting him out. So how do you get rid of Joe Manchin, who is the ultimate grifter? This is a guy who literally, their entire family business is under a trust so that he can't be sued, so it can't be taken. Isn't that convenient? It's convenient because Joe Manchin literally is holding the survival of mankind and animals and the ecosphere in his hands. You would think that the Democrats, if they were serious about climate change, if the science was really part of their bag of tricks, that they would truly find a way to figure out how to get Manchin off the tip so that we can survive. Because Joe Manchin is standing between us and survival, quite frankly. The article goes on and on and on. If you want to scroll down, Colin, we're going to go back to the article real quick. I want to take us all the way down. I'm not even going to read some of this good stuff, and there's so much good stuff in here, folks. But if you go all the way to the end, it's right there after, I guess it goes, whatever Manchin's political future may be. One thing is certain. West Virginians, the pain is only going to get worse. As other states benefits from the jobs and economic progress that come from the inevitable transition to clean energy, West Virginia risks being left even further behind. West Virginia politicians can only deny reality for so long, says Rep. Sean Casten of Illinois, who helped manage the energy transition in coal-heavy regions of southern Illinois. One way or the other, the coal plants will shut down, and the industry will shut down, and the economy will be decimated. That is exactly the wrong way to solve this problem. The right way to deal with it is to have the courage to tell West Virginians what the future really looks like and begin to prepare for it. But that is not what any of them are doing. It keeps getting better. I love this ending. After talking with Bevel, I drove through the broken streets of Beckley, past the abandoned beauty shops with vines growing over them, past billboards for divorce lawyers and ammo shops, past the markers commemorating dead coal miners near the courthouse, and onto the interstate towards Charleston. On the way, I detoured on a back road to Danville, a small town in Boone County, to visit the skeleton of the Hobbit 21 mine, where I had first witnessed the explosions and destruction of mountaintop removals mining 20 years earlier. At that time, Hobbit 21 was one of the largest mines in West Virginia, covering 12,000 acres. It was run by Arch Coal, one of the biggest mining companies in the U.S. since then. Arch Coal has gone bankrupt, reemerging as Arch Resources and shedding workers and benefits along the way. The coal mine closed down in 2015, leaving behind a blown-up mountain, streams polluted with toxic heavy metals, and workers without any preparation for life beyond coal. It's the story of West Virginia in a nutshell. I found the road to the mine, but it was closed with a chain link fence. I drove around to some back roads and was able to bushwhack up a ridge to get a view of the pit. Rock and coal and ancient mountains were exposed like layers in a wedding cake. Some scrubby locust trees grew in the reclaimed areas where Arch's mining engineers had piled up dirt to make it look vaguely like a hill. A small lake at the bottom of the pit glowed toxic blue. 20 years ago, I stood near this spot and listened to one of those engineers tell me that blowing up mountains was a good thing because it provided more flat land for commercial development. He suggested there would be a shopping mall up here one day, maybe a factory. Hundreds of people would be employed here. He told me it was a lie then, it's a lie now. There are 6 million acres of abandoned mine sites, and the U.S. solar panels have popped up on a few. And not far from where I stood, 35-acre lavender farm employs a handful of former coal miners. Hopeful as those projects may be, they are just lipstick on the coal country cadaver that Manchin pretends is still alive. Like the disemboweled mountain itself, Manchin is a scar from a time when blasting the earth to mine coal, to burn for energy that cooked that climate was a profitable thing to do. As I stood there on the ridgetop, it occurred to me that if future historians want to tell the story of how humans turned our home into a hell zone of fire, drought, and rising seas, this would be a good place as any to begin. All right. So with that, Joe Biden, Joe Biden, right? Joe Biden, the president of the United States, is absolutely stumbling around. You hear him mumbling when he does a State of the Union. The guy is not going to fight Joe Manchin. But as we know, the clock for climate crisis is ticking. Physics does not negotiate. So while we're pussyfooting around waiting for Joltin' Joe Manchin to get the fuck out of West Virginia, get the fuck out of the coal mining business, and get the fuck out of the Senate, Joe Manchin is literally putting that timer on us like a bomb ready to go off. And that, my friends, brings us to round 3. Bam. Bang, 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 call. All right, folks. So this is where it gets fun. So Politico lets out the bag that Bernie Sanders, his team, led by Weaver and others, are looking at Ro Khanna, the Silicon Valley senator. We're looking at him as potential guy for president, right? I mean, let's be fair. If you've ever met Ro Khanna is a very tall, stately man, very nice guy, very, very secure and sharp, very well spoken, really, really snazzy dresser, decent guy. Definitely looks like the president, like what you would think a president might look like. But the thing is, Ro Khanna, he's part of the gang, right? He is part of the establishment. Ro Khanna has moments where you go, yeah, Ro Khanna. He has moments where you're like going, Ro Khanna? What's up, man? What are you doing? So let's go ahead and dive into this story here a little bit and see what they're thinking. So ultimately, let me pull this up. Give me 1 second. Here we go. Sorry about that, folks. Top figures from Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign privately encouraging Ro Khanna to run for president in 2024. If Joe Biden doesn't seek a second term, giving the California congressman, I said senator earlier, congressman, strap that one and scratch it off, man. Sorry about that. So California congressman, an important stamp of approval from progressives as the party looks to a post-Biden future. Jeff Weaver, Sanders' former presidential campaign manager, and Mark Longambaugh, a senior advisor to Sanders during his 2016 bid, have both urged Khanna to consider a campaign in the event that Biden declines to run again. Now, let's just stop for a second. They're going to talk about it in a second. Okay, it's going to come up in the article in just a second. But I want to play spoiler here for a minute. Not only do you not believe, and I don't believe, and I don't think anyone believed, that Joe Biden would necessarily run for a second term. Some of us were even shocked that he made it through the campaign for the first term, considering he was hidden away during all the primaries. Okay. Somehow or another, all of a sudden, Bernie capitulated to that. And voila, the guy comes out like he'd been tan rested and ready in a nice hibernation during the primary. He comes out and says, hey, I'm the front runner now, after Clyburn and the rest of them tipped their hand. But the fact is, he picked Kamala Harris. They've been trying to groom Kamala Harris for some time. And they had all the little stories there to try and make her bulletproof, all the emotional hostage taking about her childhood and about being someone who is coming from a place of minority, and she's, come from downtrodden area, blah, blah, blah. But that's not true. Kamala Harris has been a cop. She has preyed and predated on Black and brown people herself as Attorney General. She has done more harm than just about anyone. And they know that she's unelectable. She didn't get not a single delegate during the primaries. Not a single one. Think about that. It's pretty tough to do. But she didn't get any. So Joe Biden is sitting there, dead letter office himself, with a cop that no one wants to elect. And they know it. Leaders know this. Even though she's quote unquote the top dog because she's vice president, folks understand Kamala doesn't have any charisma whatsoever. K-Hive will get all butthurt about it, but the fact is that there's absolutely nothing presidential about Kamala Harris. And maybe that's a good thing in a roundabout way, because what have our presidents been? Our presidents have been nothing but slick-selling snake oil salesmen, and they have literally lied to us. It's all about shucking and jiving. And if you remember, when Obama was bragging about being the oil president, I mean, just shut up and be happy. Look at your stock portfolio, right? So the neo-libs have their neo-libs. And the fact of the matter is, your neo-libs want Kamala Harris. But Bernie Sanders is trying to enter into the game with Ro Khanna. So let's go back to the article here. So Democratic office holders are reluctant to speak publicly about the ambitions in a potential open race in 2024 out of concern. I love this. Out of concern that they could undermine the president, who has said he plans to campaign for a second term if he's in good health. There is also sensitivities surrounding Vice President Kamala Harris, aka Kamala, who is atop the list of possible candidates, but faces skepticism from some party insiders who fear she cannot win a general election. Notice they said that not something about winning a primary, and that's because they rigged primaries in the Democratic Party, as we've seen. But growing list of Democratic governors, senators, and House members are turning their attention to the possibility of a primary in 2 years that does not include Biden, given the president's advanced age and dismal approval ratings. Roughly half of Americans don't expect Biden, now 79 years old, will run for a second term, according to a recent Wall Street Journal poll. The talks between Khanna and current former Sanders advisors offers a window into the hushed, behind-the-scenes conversations that Democrats are having in the event that Biden doesn't seek re-election. They also demonstrate that a key part of Sanders' brain trust is looking to Khanna, a close ally to the Vermont senator, as his heir apparent. I think Ro would be a very effective candidate, said Longabaugh, who stressed that he was only referring to a scenario in which Biden did not run again in 2024. This guy has a message that's very powerful. Ro is basically saying, is there a way in which we can reconstruct the economy so that all the wealth is not just being generated on the East Coast, West Coast, or out of my congressional district? In an interview, Khanna made clear he had no intention of challenging Biden and expressed strong support for his reelection. But he did not close the door to 2028. I love this. Listen to this. I'm not running in 2024, Khanna said. I fully expect the president to run and intend to support him strongly. If for some reason he didn't, that would be very disappointing. Why would it be disappointing, dude? Shut up. But there are a number of other candidates who I think could get behind, who would make sure that the Democrats beat Donald Trump. They're already predicting Donald Trump will be the candidate next go round. Think about that. Khanna has long operated like someone interested in running for president. This is really, really wild. Wait till you hear this. He spent considerable time in the early voting states campaigning with Sanders as a co-chair of his 2020 presidential bid. Khanna has also leveraged his connections in Silicon Valley to bring technology jobs to the early presidential states. Fancy that, buttering grease in the skids there. In 2018, Khanna toured historically black colleges and universities in South Carolina with Rep. Jim Clyburn, and later helped establish a partnership between Zoom and Claflin University. During the 2020 presidential cycle, Khanna used his campaign funding to place more than $100,000 worth of print ads in Iowa, which boosted his efforts to create tech jobs in the state, including in the rural areas. Khanna also helped deliver a $1 million grant for Iowa State University, as well as scholarships, digital apprenticeships, and other investments for the state. Now, let's stop there for a second. If I'm providing you these things, Ro Khanna is maybe the best of the worst, or maybe he's just a good opportunity here. Maybe if you believe that there's a chance of a real progressive getting elected, he's definitely got very, very neoliberal traits. Okay. But he's maybe the best of the worst. I don't know. I like Ro as a person. I've actually met him, shaken hands with him, talked to him, etc. But when you think about this, it's like we have been so conditioned to really, really bad people in office. What would a Ro Khanna presidency even look like? Ultimately, you still have the puppet masters up above. You still have the lobbyists he'd have to deal with. You still have the fact that he's in Silicon Valley, where the Silicon Valley oligarchs literally are building the gig economy like crazy. So I'd be interested in seeing what, if anything, he would have to say about eliminating that kind of gig economy work, given the state of Silicon Valley. Let's get back to the article here. People aren't going to early states at this point because they're not interested, said Democratic consultant Joe Casazzo, a veteran campaigns in the first in the nation primary state of New Hampshire. It's crystal clear that Ro Khanna is a part of the next generation of progressive leadership in America. So is Pete Buttigieg, sadly, and he ain't no progressive, right? The three-term congressman cuts a unique profile. The 45-year-old is a diehard liberal who happens to also represent the startup paradise of Silicon Valley. He calls himself a progressive capitalist. There you go. And envisions a future in which America's eroding democracy is strengthened by spreading well-paying technology jobs across the heartland. Khanna's supporters believe that he would begin a presidential race with significant portion of Sanders' political infrastructure and likely become a top contender for progressive voters. I think he would have tremendous appeal among people who supported Bernie. I do, absolutely, 100%, said Weaver. He has a thoughtful take on the economy, which I think a lot of working class people that Democrats have had difficulty reaching would hear. Now, let's stop right there for a second. I happen to know, even though he doesn't use the terms, I happen to know that Ro Khanna has talked with others like Stephanie Kelton, Bernie's economic advisor. And I happen to have talked to him directly, like face to face, in DC, as we were getting ready to speak at the Millions for Medicare March a few years back. And in that time when I talked to Ro Khanna, I asked him why he continued to talk about taxpayer dollars, why he continued to talk about these things when he knew the truth, why he continued to talk about reducing the deficit and so forth. And he said point blank, the only reason you would want to reduce the deficit was to stave off inflation. I was like, it's not really the right answer, but it was better answer than a lot of other people would say. A lot of other people would immediately say that the money tree was something that was causing inflation. But Ro Khanna got big mad props from Stephanie Kelton years back. And she said, leapfrogging who was then the star child, AOC, he leapt over her to have Kelton call him out and say, here's somebody who gets it. Now, whether you like Ro Khanna or not, I'm not digging the whole idea of a progressive capitalist. But in the lieu of having a capitalist who's not progressive, Because if you remember, going way back to Teddy Roosevelt and Wilson and the rest of them, the progressive movement kind of had a little bit of that Republican feel to it, right? It was a little bit of the way, it was definitely a kind of like just out there. It's all about progress, but progress to where? Where are you taking us, right? If you're going to take us further into a gig economy, if you're going to make us consumption units and you're not going to build out job guarantees and build out public infrastructure and you're not going to get rid of student debt and you're not going to take on a Green New Deal, you're not going to do those sorts of things, then it doesn't much matter. But I do know for a fact that at the time, Ro Khanna was a Green New Dealer. Okay. Ro Khanna also supports Medicare for all. Now, whether he's backpedaled because of his support for Biden or not, just painting a picture for 2024. If you are going to support a candidate, I guess who else would they pick? I guess he probably is one of the most well-rounded, sharp candidates that they could pick out of the bunch. But this is the Democratic Party. This is the Democratic Party. And this is where we have to start scratching our heads. Would Ro Khanna just be a more manageable candidate than Biden? Would he be a better spoken candidate? For sure. For sure. He's a better spoken candidate than Joe Biden. But the thing that you have to ask yourself is who is Ro Khanna? Who are you for real? Not who are you as a Democratic operative, not who are you as a campaign manager for Bernie Sanders, but who are you if you were to have the full reign of the power of the United States government and to be able to use the bully pulpit to get these things done? Would you be like Elizabeth Warren, who instead of thinking about how we can make green energy free to all, instead of looking at how we can make it and nationalize, our renewable energy, wanting to build markets to sell it, to quote unquote pay for it, which is ridiculous. Okay. What would he do? I do know that he understands that the government can pay for anything. I do know that. I know that for fact. So which Ro Khanna would you get? And will he ever have the opportunity to run? Or will they prop up Kamala Harris? There's no viable third party right now. There's no viable candidate that we see right now. There's no real push for a third party right now that has actual teeth that can build anything beyond that. So what you're really looking at right now is who are they going to put forward? If you're into political, elections, if you're into electoral politics, if you're into following this stuff, who else would you put forward? Question you should ask yourself, because time is ticking. And with that, this was Steve Grumbine with Let's Get Ready to Grumble. And Colin, thank you, brother, for bringing this through. Hopefully everybody enjoyed themselves. I'm going to go ahead and read some of these things. Jay the Informant, $2. Joe Biden or Sleepy Joe, shake my head. K. Faye Helen G, $10. Thank you so much. Mad Ocelot God gave $5. It's Dave Anthony should run for president. He's hilarious. He's got a public speaking experience. He's very well informed. His politics are way better than Ro. Robin Bennett, thank you. Double K, a big $49.99. Are you out of your mind? That's awesome. Thank you so much. And let's go up here and see what else we got. Double K, is that another 49? Anyway, listen, folks, thank you so much for being with us today. This was a lot of fun for me. We'll get it back together next week. There's none of this. There's no Rumble in the Jungle with Grumble here. We're going to have Colin and Jordan are going to be in Florida covering things. But we'll be back in 2 weeks, and we're going to see if we can tighten this puppy up. But not bad for day number 1, Colin. Thank you so much. Take a bow. I'm Steve Grumbine. We're out of here.